Hi, everybody, and welcome to Exegetically Speaking, a podcast of the friends and faculty of Wheaton College, Wheaton, Illinois, and the Lanier Theological Library in Houston, Texas. My name is David Capes, and I am the Senior Research Fellow at the Lanier Theological Library and a former dean up there in Wheaton at the School of Biblical and Theological Studies. Our purpose in these podcasts is really very simple. We want to promote the study of biblical languages, Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic, so we can read the Bible more faithfully, study it more fully, and not just read it, but to live it. Joining me today on Exegetically Speaking, Dr. Michael Graves, who's been with us before. He's the Armerding Professor of Biblical Studies at Wheaton College. He did his undergraduate work at Wheaton College and went on to do an MPhil and a PhD at Hebrew Union College. Dr. Graves, welcome.
Yeah, thank you very much, David. Good to be here. Nice to see you again.
Good to see you as well. Now, you're working on a commentary on Jeremiah. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so just real brief, this is a long-term project because Jeremiah is such a big book, but I'm working on a commentary on Jeremiah that is in the category of one of these theological commentaries. It's in the International Theological Commentaries series. So I am doing my own translation from the Hebrew and some text critical work and that kind of thing in it. But the main goal of it is to do a sort of coherent, systematically theological exposition. So I'm not even halfway through it yet. So don't throw away your other commentaries yet. But it'll eventually emerge, God willing.
Yeah, I mean, these things are long-term projects, right? I mean, they take 20 years to do and to do a great job. And it's not unheard of to do like a 10-year, project, that kind of thing. Yeah. I want to talk today about Jeremiah 29:11, and the reason is because we're at the end of the COVID year, 2020, moving into 2021. Everybody's hopeful. Everybody hopes that the future is a little bit brighter. And one of the verses that is often Googled and looked for on Bible programs like BibleGateway.com is Jeremiah 29:11. And they quote it and they take it, as a kind of a personal promise. Let me read it, and then I want to get your thoughts about it based upon both the context of it, which is important for exegesis, but also some of the language about it, okay?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, absolutely.
For surely I know the plans I have for you, says the Lord. Plans for your welfare and not for harm, to give you a future with hope. It's a very positive, very hopeful kind of passage. Mm-hmm. Tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, sure. So obviously it's a great passage for people to put on their refrigerators, or hang on the wall, because it does seem so positive and encouraging in terms of what God has planned for us. It can be misunderstood, I think, if you apply it without any reference to the context at all. So that's kind of what we'll be talking about.
Yeah, exactly.
One thing I would say, though, is that although we'll see it does have a specific context, it is a great, wonderful verse. I don't have any objection to people putting it on their refrigerators. I think it's a wonderful passage. It's just good. It's important for us to apply it in such a way that we take cognizance of its context, and then that keeps us from misapplying it.
Yeah, exactly.
So, the context then is that Jeremiah prophesies at a very hard time in the history of God's people. They've been very sinful, and as a result of that, God is allowing them to be judged, and by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. The city will be destroyed, the temple will be dismantled, and many of the people are already at this point being taken into captivity into Babylon. So the number one thing to realize about this is that God said that he was going to tear down, but then he was going to build up. But it has to be in that order. Jeremiah 1:10 introduces this. God's going to tear down and destroy, but then he'll build up and he'll plant. But you have to deal with the sin before you get to the rebuilding and planting.
Gotcha.
So it's got to be in that order. I sometimes think of it as the Tin Woodman theology, if you know the lions and tigers and bears, from The Wizard of Oz, where I think at one point Dorothy says, you think it's going to get lighter. And I think it's a Tin Woodman who says, I think it's going to get darker before it gets lighter. And that's Jeremiah's message, is you got to deal with the sin first, then it'll be okay. So what happens in Jeremiah 29 is that there are a bunch of people in Judah who already were taken captive by the Babylonians in 597 BC, about 10 years before the city finally falls. And there's people who are still resisting God, the servants of the wicked king Zedekiah, and even some false prophets in Judea and Babylon. And for those people who are still resisting God, Jeremiah, if you read the surrounding chapter, Jeremiah writes to them that God has judgment for them. So it's not, this passage is not a blank check that says that, I have Jeremiah 29 on my refrigerator and I'm doing evil and I'm doing extortion and I'm robbing my neighbor's, chicken coop, but God plans blessing plan for me. So the passage clearly doesn't mean that because there are people resisting God for whom judgment is promised. But for those who are in exile, and they're in exile precisely because, the people had sinned, God nevertheless will care for them even in that situation.
Even in
God
exile.
Even in exile,
Yeah.
even in the dark spots, even in parts that are hard, even in parts that are hard, partly again, it's my fault that they're hard. Even there, if I will simply look to God, God will care for me and he will bless me and he will give me a future and a hope. And then they're going to spend their life in exile, but God promises he will allow their children eventually to go back home to Judea. So the passage in some ways kind of has a dark context, but I think that's the meaning of it, is that if you look to God even in that darkness, then God will have a future for you. It may not be everything we want, and it may not be as soon as we want it, but God still has it planned for good. So I think that's the message for me.
So the message for them was that, and how do you sort of read that when it says, "I have a plan for you, I want for things to go well for you, for there to be no harm, to give you a future and a hope." How do you take that then from that context and move it into your own?
Right. Yeah, sure. So, probably the most famous word that in the Hebrew that occurs there is the word God has plans of welfare for them. That is shalom. So shalom is peace, but it's also just welfare, well-being, overall wellness. And so, again, I think I would start with what was the message for them. And that is that they're out there in Babylon in exile because of, of the sinfulness of the people as a whole. But while they're there, rather than just suffering and misery, God is going to allow them to marry, to plant vineyards, to build houses, and to prosper, even in the midst of exile. And in fact, they did prosper so much that, later on in the book of Esther, even after a bunch of Judeans were allowed to go home, like in Ezra and Nehemiah, there are still thousands and thousands of Jews living in Persia in the book of Esther. Well, if they could go home, why didn't they? Well, the reason why is because Jeremiah 29:11 was right. God prospered so many of them in exile that they didn't even want to go home when they had the chance to. So when I think about that, what that reminds me of is that, sometimes things don't go right for me. Sometimes I am judged, or maybe I suffer from my own mistakes, or I suffer from other people's mistakes, or whatever. And I might not get what I want. They didn't get to go home right away. God said, you have to accept that you're going to be in exile for basically your whole life. But I know that I can trust God as God, not to give me what I want, but that in the long term, God has a future and a plan for me that's good, even in the midst of distress. And, David, the analogy that I think of is when our kids were little, they would be bad. Like my son, who's an adult now, he was 2 or 3, Ben, he would misbehave, and we'd put him in the pack and play. Kind of was like
The
prison,
pack and play
for
prison.
little people.
Yes. Yes.
Pack and play prison. And then we'd start feeling bad for him being in pack and play prison. So we'd give him a biter biscuit. Then we'd give him his favorite teddy bear. Then we'd give him his favorite blanket. And after a while, he was sitting in pack and play prison, and he forgot that he was in prison because he had all of the stuff and he was just having a good time in there. And that's because we love him. It's like we had to put him in there, but we love him. We take care of him. And so I think if that's a picture of God, it's not a specific promise that you'll get X, Y, or Z. But if it's a picture of God that you get out of this passage, that's the picture, is that even in the judgment of his people, he loves them and he wants to care for them. And I think that's an encouraging message.
Thanks, Michael, for being with us today on Exegetically Speaking.
Absolutely. Thank you, David. Blessings.
Thanks to Silvio Vasquez, Rebecca Larson, and Krista Sanchez for helping us to produce this podcast. Thanks as well to Phil Keggy for our music. If you want to study biblical languages, the best place you could do that is Wheaton College. They have an amazing program, one of the best I've ever seen, whether you want to be a graduate or an undergraduate student. So go to the website, www.wheaton.edu, and look for modern and classical languages. Get started today. If you have questions or comments about this podcast, we'd love to hear from you. Contact us at exegetically.speaking@wheaton.edu. That's exegetically.speaking@wheaton.edu. Thanks for listening.